Stay naked. I hope that you can take it.
What can be learned from a story, woven out of fragmented moments of joy, pain, and blissful awareness? I wrote my first book, Flesh Mapping, in 2013. It was an invitation into co-creating a pedagogy, a way of learning through our shared narratives of place and politics, a way of mapping the injuries of the material, emotional, spiritual impact of all our many journeys of growth. Some may call it struggle, forced poverty, displacement, hunger, and war. As a child raised in war, I've learned many lessons. And in the art of living, I'm inviting some of my heroes, some of the people who walk with me, who have taught me to walk in beautiful ways, to see co-creation, to see community as our immunity to pain, to suffering, to wanting. Welcome. I'm your host, Sylvia Richardson, and this is The Art of Living. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by an icon of mine. Dr. Silvia Federici is the author of one of my favorite books right now, Revolution at Point Zero. And I'm delighted that this book is available because it really represents the decades of struggle that women have been engaged to not only make housework and social reproduction visible as a form of work, but also to be valued. Delighted to have you on our show, Sylvia. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much, you, for inviting me.
Now, one of the things that it's on everybody's mind is, we are in pandemic mode, right? We've seen the lockdowns worldwide. People are scared. We've lost friends, we've lost people we love, and for many people, this has meant not just isolation, but also economic inequality. There's a lot of talk about the essential work. We love our essential workers. Who are the essential workers? And how do we visibilize, because in many ways we have been invisibilized. How do we make this work visible and valued?
First of all, most of them are women, and I'll say the essential workers are the workers who are most engaged on a day-to-day basis, to reproduce people's lives, to ensure that people are alive and they're well and they prosper. And now everybody acknowledges, the key role the nurses have played. And, so correctly we say, nurses are our heroes. At the same time, we also have to see that there are many other essential workers who have not been recognized, which is all the thousands, millions of women who, in addition to having jobs outside the home, or whether they do not have jobs outside the home, every day they're working, to reproduce their families, send people, make sure that people are able to go to work, kids going to school, and doing an infinite variety of jobs, from the cleaning, the cooking, the shopping, the budgeting, the emotional work of consoling people. And this has been so much invisible. I think it's become a bit more visible in the pandemic, because of the crisis. The crisis that has been there, has been lived by so many women on a day-to-day basis, has exploded. When women have often had to come back into the home since, the children could not go to school or could not go to a daycare center. And there they had often to do telework, take care of the family, take care of the children, and also take care means following them through school and dealing with the trauma, the emotional problems of kids not understanding what is taking place. So I think we need to see that essential work includes a vast number of people, mostly women, not exclusively, who are really catering to the daily production of life, which also includes dealing with people with chronic diseases, dealing with people who are getting old and are not any longer self-sufficient. I think that often when we speak of reproductive work, maybe we think of child raising, but it's actually much broader than that. All the, question of aging and, particularly, in the COVID epidemic, we've seen how vulnerable, older people have been. So I hope that we are at a turning point. I hope that the crisis that has been happening in the home, in the family, in the community, because of this epidemic, is making people more aware. It's, consciousness raising about these essential workers as well, because the work of reproducing life in this society is being totally devalued. And those who have been paying the price has been mostly women. And now that crisis is unsustainable.
I was reading that more than 168 million children worldwide are now being schooled at home. And of course, that work,
Yeah.
you're right, falls on the women. I think even more alarming is that as this idea of telework, of working from home on your computer, has become the so-called new normal for some people,
Oh, yes.
it also has meant the loss of millions of jobs. I think the International Labor Organization recently reported that 24.7 million jobs were lost. And of course, job losses usually disproportionately affect women and migrants. So can we talk a little bit about, this so-called inevitable crisis that we face? Because, we have been in an economic downturn since 2008, and then as 2020, met yet another crisis, right, of
Yeah,
capitalism.
yes.
We are now faced with pandemic and yet new levels of punishing inequality. So can we talk about how has it been possible for capitalism to be so normalized, for people to just accept that this is the way it is. This is, the capitalist system is the way we organize our economic and social lives around.
I think that many people understand that this system is fundamentally unjust, is fundamentally productive of inequality, including racial inequality, gender inequality. And I think that unfortunately so many people have so engaged in a daily struggle for survival that it becomes difficult, to even have the time or to be able to devote to the kind of struggle that is really necessary. It's happening, but not clearly enough to really make profound change, which is what we need. But you're right, capitalism has gone from a crisis to crisis to crisis. And these are crises that are completely avoidable. These are crises that could have been absolutely predicted. For instance, the pandemic. This is so obvious that something of this type was going to happen, because we have seen, starting in the 1980s, that all throughout the world, with the constant expansion of capitalist relations in Africa, Latin America, which means, land being privatized, communal relations being destroyed, austerity program being imposed, government investment in services, basic necessities being constantly curtailed. That with that, there's been also an increase of mortality and epidemics. All through the 80s, and continuing. You talk about Africa, meningitis, cholera, Zika, Ebola, and you name it, and the avian flu. So all throughout the world. So it was a matter of time. And on the other hand, all through this period, in the United States, in the so-called affluent countries, There's been a constant, cut in basic services, in basic investment in healthcare, for instance. I'm in New York, and 20 hospitals have been shut down in the last, 21 years because they were not enough profitable. They were not able to fill all the beds all the time. So when, COVID comes, they have to, all of a sudden, major crisis. They have to, use emergency spaces because too many people and they are submerged and the hospitals are overrun. Well, the hospitals are overrun because they've also been systematically shut down. And also investment in essential equipment. From year to year, if you look at the state budget, you will see that the most essential services, those are the most important for our lives, from childcare to services for the elderly and healthcare services. These have been the first, to be cut. So this was a crisis that is a political crisis more than a health crisis. This is a crisis that could have been very well anticipated, and I would say it's man-made. It's not a crisis that is to do with somehow, the natural world, going astray. So again, it is to be hoped that this is an alarm bell, is a warning, because this is not the end of it. And I think it's extremely worrisome also that now, everything is the vaccine. There's no discussion, for instance, about not only, therapy. For every disease, there has to be some therapy. We haven't heard anything about therapies. But also, I think that what is worrisome is that the environmental and social conditions that have been most important, in the, exacerbation of the crisis are not being addressed. I mean, I know in New York, for instance, one of the areas that has been most severely affected is the Bronx, because there the air is so polluted. For many, many years, it's been a crisis place. Children have asthma. People are, children at very early age have asthma. So the immunity system of people have been compromised, by polluted air, polluted water, food that is not nutritious, pesticides, etc. And of course, social inequalities. Social inequalities are fundamental. And so this is what we really have to confront. This epidemic is really not an issue only of vaccine and viruses. It's really an issue of social decision. What is being invested in? Right now, much investment is going into police, is going into armaments, and or even into space exploration, and less it's been invested into the reproduction of our lives. And this has to change.
When our hospital decided they need a triage because they have, a mill and they have all this, very dangerous industry that, if something happened, they need something, right? So they were raising money, and someone wrote a big sign and said, wouldn't it be great if the military had to have bake sales to get their funding and we properly found our hospitals? And I thought that's really brilliant, and it's a little tongue in cheek, but it really speaks about the legacy that neoliberalism has had on our lives, right? This idea of privatizing all our social safety,
Right.
and that were won, by the way, by very diligent struggles. In your book, you make very clear that not only alienated labor of women was the ground zero for the imposition, the very violent imposition of capitalism, but it continues to be that way. It continues to be this level of devalorizing our work, devalorizing the energy and contribution that we bring, that enables us enables us to not see how, we not only are we participating in our own oppression, but how, permitting there to be a second class, layer of citizens that work under the table. There are the temporary workers that, they're the ones who pick our food. They're the nannies, who leave their own children
Yeah.
to come and look after our children. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the connection, not only of globalizing inequality, and how, the costs of that, are being detrimental to our well-being, our understanding of who we are, our connection to ourselves, to nature, and to each other.
Yeah, what is happening? I mean, that's the problem. Capitalism has been able to thrive, to accumulate indecent, obscene amount of wealth, the companies and the individual as well, on the basis of the creation of a whole set of hierarchies and of a whole set of population who barely can survive. The more, in fact, workers are engaged in the accumulation of wealth, the more they are exploited, the more their life has been really reduced to daily misery. And, we see with a lot of working class women or working with no compensation, if they want to have any money, any autonomy, they have to do two jobs. And also we see, that look at the United States. Much of the work of reproduction, is done by the labor of people, whose work has been, exploited with an intensity. Think of the farm workers, all immigrants, all basically paid with something from forces them to live from hand to mouth. All the services, in fact, are done majority by migrant work. And most of the time, people have no benefits. We have really bills compensation on the level of survival. Right? So the creation of this incredible inequality. Capitalism is built on a system of slavery. And when slavery was finished, then you had Jim Crow. You had other forms of forced labor. They were more hidden, but they were basically slavery revised. And this is what continuously being repeated, which is the reason why, hand in hand with the exploitation, you also have such incredible system, of repression and control and surveillance. This assassination that we see throughout the community in the United States of black people, of black youth in particular, they're really at the service of maintaining a whole system of brutal exploitation, where, black people, in a way, for the majority, are still in some form of slavery or another. And it's also, of course, next to it is migrant people. Look at what is happening at the border. What is happening at the border is inconceivable. For many, many, many months at the border, families are being separated. They have no idea. Many families, they don't know where the children are. They have been sent back to Guatemala. They have been sent back, and you wonder, how is it possible? What could explain such level of barbarity, such level of cruelty? And then you have to piece it together, and you piece it together with an economic system that is built on the ability to impose enormous system of exploitation, enormous extraction of labor from people. You take everything from them, you take their life, you take their youth, and then you give them back pittance. You give them back just enough to go by every day with a lot of anxiety about the future. We now understand, this system has to be changed. Has to be changed. It's too unjust. The injustice, and no matter how many, reform, the basics still remain there. The basics still remain there. We see in the U.S. every new administration guarantees that more money will go to the military, that the military will always be well funded, the police will always be well funded. But, very little is actually done to really profoundly change the condition of the millions who are at the bottom. This requires really a very sustained mobilization with a good long-term objective, with a vision really of the creation of a different society.
I'm curious, what inspires you? Because for me, I think despite all this aggression against Black people, I did see a Black Lives Movement rise up, in 2020 in the middle of pandemic. 26 million people participated. To me, there's still a lot of energy in our movements. There's still people who dream of a world without capitalism.
Oh, no, absolutely. You're absolutely right. For instance, look in terms of women's struggle also. I've been so impressed by what has been taking place in Latin America, in places like Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, where over the last 2-3 years, millions of women have gone to the streets and really also obtaining, important change, like in Argentina, for instance, despite a very, very strong mobilization by the right wing, they were able to obtain the right for abortion. And more than that, because what has been happening, particularly in the Cono Sur, has been that political spaces have been created where the women coming from different places, campesinas, indigenous, women from the unions, from the solidarity economies, come together and they can begin to formulate a common agenda. And they can begin, despite differences, debate, but nevertheless they can begin to work together. And there's something really new and very powerful that is taking place. And then you're right, with Black Lives Matter. And in the movement we're also seeing, in the last months, much more participation also of white youth than we have seen in a long, long time, not at least since the 1960s. Working to change this world, I think, is the most satisfying work that you can do in this society.
When I was working with women in South Africa post apartheid, they said to me repeatedly, life always finds a way. Life always finds
Yeah.
a way. And I love that because I think that we are life. In
Yeah.
our struggle, we breathe life into new
Mm-hmm.
ideas, new visions of what a society without injustice could look like. You write beautifully about the commons. Why commons? What is the commons? Because as a child growing up in a war-torn country, during, the only way you survive was through community. And my mother always taught us community is immunity. And it's ironic in time of pandemic we are told to isolate and separate. But
Yes.
to me,
Yeah.
my immunity, my ability to survive is really dependent on that community. So perhaps you can talk about the commons. What do we mean by creating a commons?
Yeah. So, it means many things. The broadest way to think of the common is to think that this is a principle of organizing society, is a conception of the social organization. So you have capitalism, which is built on the private, which is built on fragmentation, which is built on exploitation. The idea of the common is a very different principle of organizing society. It's the idea of a society where you have cooperation, you don't have competition. We're always talking about compete, America first. Also the idea that you compete, you have to be the first, and you don't care, of course, what happens to the others that presumably are left behind. So the idea of cooperation, the idea of sharing the wealth, rather than exploiting other people, but actually having access to the wealth that, is produced and also the natural wealth. And collectively taking responsibility also for the environment and for each other. So that's the idea of the sharing, the idea of basically creating forms of reproduction, that are more collective, that are more social, that are not isolating us from each other. As for example, everybody has their little house, their nuclear family, and so on, which doesn't mean that we cannot have strong relation with other people. But the way it is organized, this notion of the private, which is not private at all, because really our life in so many ways, it's supervised, is shaped, controlled, and determined, by capital, by the state. But this idea of the private life, which, separates us from other people. So the idea of the commons is, again, the idea of a different way of organizing society. And then also, we can break it down, into the everyday life. For example, common is every kind of practice that brings people together, and particularly practices that have to do, with the reproduction of life. As you say, the community, the fact that, being able to rely on other people, being able not to face the system alone. And it's the only way, in fact, to overcome the crisis that we are living. I've written a lot about what I've seen, and for instance, Latin America, where repeatedly, in so many countries, because of the crisis that people have gone through, the austerity problem, losing their land, and so on, the response has been either total defeat or actually uniting with other people and trying to create collective forms of reproduction, like the popular kitchen, the collective kitchen, the communal gardens, taking over some public land and sowing some things, so that now, for instance, we have so many examples of urban farming. People have lost the land. Instead of, just accepting their defeat, when they were forced to go to the city, well, they came together and took over some land, built some houses, built some streets, made some gardens. You see that all over Latin America. And also you see it in the United States. You see it in Canada. So I think that communal spirit, which is being historically so strong, in America, Galeano wrote, Eduardo Galeano, the great, Uruguayan poet and writer, he wrote that the spirit of the commons is the strongest spirit, is the strongest principle of American culture, and it's the oldest and the strongest. And I think we have to recuperate it. The indigenous community, I think one of the reasons, for instance, that in Latin America we're seeing such powerful struggles, is because there you still have a whole indigenous culture in which the life is organized on the principle of the common. And that idea that my life is connected to yours, and that I cannot think of my life and anything I do purely individually, is something that really has been a strong support in the face of American imperialism, in the face of over and over so many crises, military coup, and etc. This is what has kept people going. This is what has kept people continuing to struggle. And this has been an inspiration. People have spoken, I heard several times people speaking of that we are witnessing an indigenization of the struggle. Indigenization of the struggle is another way of speaking of the commons.
Thank you again for being with us. Thank you for everything that you do and for all the ways you have not only opened my eyes to a multitude of ways of embracing my own power, of embracing the struggles of women that came before me and that continue to struggle today. So thank you again.
Oh, thanks to you, Sylvia. You're doing great work, believe me, and I thank you for your very, very generous words. You're a very generous person, and I really admire you.
Thank you for listening to The Art of Living. I'm an educational consultant and artist, authored. For more information about upcoming events, workshops, retreats, please reach out to sylviarichardson.com. Until next time, remember to be playful, to celebrate joy, and to allow love in all your co-creations.
You'll never have to wonder where the groove went. The groove is you.